ahead and start. I expect more stragglers to come in. You guys brave the cold. Quick poll. First time at one of the data visualization meetups? Wow, big grab. All right. First time at Meetup at all. I know there were a couple. Yeah, fabulous. Tell your friends. It's hard to get people who aren't already know about Meetup to learn about the events we have and the organization we have. So my name's Randy Crump. I organize the group. Real quickly about me, my company is called InfoNoop, the data visualization design company that I founded. I run the website Cool Infographics. Conveniently, my book is also called Cool Infographics. It's funny how that worked out. The DataViz group, we really cover anything that has to do with visualizing data. So from better PowerPoint charts to what's called sketchnoting and taking visual notes and visual note-taking, all the way to the programming side and doing R and D3.
Take a left on University Boulevard.
No, you made it. You're here. Yeah.
You are now here.
You have arrived at your destination. We also like to invite a lot of the tools out there. So Tableau, IBM Watson Analytics, Click has been out here a number of times. And so they come out and demonstrate whatever their new features are and how you integrate their tools with data as well. I also teach a course at SMU here. It's a 6-week course, and I'll talk about that in just a second. If anybody's interested, the first chapter of my book is available to download for free at coolinfographics.com. I also have a couple copies if you just want to page through it and take a look. So the group is sort of sponsored by us. SMU gives us space to meet, which is fabulous. We balance between Dallas and Plano. I find all the people in Dallas don't want to drive up to Plano, and all the people in Plano don't want to drive down into Dallas. So we sort of bounce back and forth. I'm out in the mid-city, so it's the same for me either way. It doesn't matter. This month and last month, IBM was gracious enough to provide refreshments. So all the drinks over here provided by IBM Cloud. Daryl over here is here from IBM. Thank you very much, Daryl. Please have drink anytime you need to get up and grab one. Please do, otherwise we're bringing them all next time too. SMU is starting this month, and it's starting very quickly on the 22nd, a Digital Analytics Insights Certificate Program. And they gave me this discount code if anybody's interested in using its VIP instructor 10, INS 10. We'll get you 10% off their certificate program, but basically it'll get you 10% off anything that SMU offers, the continuing and professional ed. So this is my course coming up in April and May. It's a 6-week course on best practices for visualizing data, and then how do you apply that when you use data visualizations in infographics and in dashboards and in anywhere else you use data visualization. So it's a 6-week course in the evenings. It's 3 hours a night. I think it's Tuesday nights this time. Something like that. So that's coming up, and the same code works for my class and 10% off. Anything you want to take from SMU Kate, there's your code. We're always looking for more sponsors. We've had a couple opportunities that we actually flew in some speakers, but it's a free group to join. It's a free group for our members, so we're always looking for local groups or sponsors to help us bring in big headline kind of speakers. So if you're interested, I do have a couple of sponsor sheets. If you think your company might be interested, it's something you can take back to them. I do like to pause. If anybody, your company is hiring, whether it's data visualization, data science, analytics, and you want to announce it to the group and sort of do a little bit of networking, does anybody have anything they want to share from open positions? I am recording. I try to record most of our events because we have 2,400 members now, which is fabulous. But we, obviously not everybody can come to the events, and you pick and choose which ones you're interested in. So if you go out to the bit.ly DFW DataViz video, I think I've got 10 of them out there of past events, and I've probably got 5 where I've got the raw video. I just haven't put it together to post it yet. So I'll get around to that too. So upcoming events, we know what February's event is going to be. February, we have Vish is actually here tonight. You want to say a few words about visual process mining or visualizing your process mining?
Sure. So I'm Vish Budagupta, I'm the CTO of Divergence AI, and we specialize in process mining.
And process mining is a technology that is able to look at the event data, whether it be ERP data or clickstream data or whatever data it is, and it automatically constructs the process. Like on the right side, what you see is a process graph. And essentially answers questions like, where are the bottlenecks in my process? Everybody knows that most of their processes, I've never heard anybody say our process is absolutely great. Never heard it. But if you ask them exactly where the bottlenecks are, where the compliance violations are happening, very few people actually have intelligence on that. And this is a whole field that does that. So we'll discuss about that. There's also another, so this is on February 6th. On February 10th, there's another conference called the International Data Engineers and Data Science Conference, IDEAS Conference, happening at UTD. So that's another great place where there are a lot of speakers in the data science area, a lot of pretty awesome speakers. So just announcing that as well.
Dan, would you post a link to the conference in that group? That would help. Yeah, this doesn't say, this will be on February 6th. But like I said, we bounce back and forth, so we're in Dallas. This time, this one's going to be up at the Plano campus off of Tennyson, up in Plano. And then, anybody else have an event coming up or anything you want to promote? Okay, we'll keep going. Like I said, it's a pretty casual group. I'm usually just trying to find speakers and topics. I've got a couple months of potential speakers lined up, but I mean, we've got the whole year in the future. So let me know if you have a topic you want to speak about, if there's a topic you'd like to hear about, even if you don't know who the speaker could be. I can work on that and get some feedback from you guys as to what kinds of topics you'd like to see. So don't be afraid to either post it in the comments or send me a note. I've got business cards, but you can also, Meetup lets you send a note to the organizer and it just emails it straight to me. So anything you can think of and you want to provide feedback is appreciated. Okay, so tonight, Jainan, let's turn everything on and move over.
And now, cool, all set?
Yep.
All right. So since we are recording this and before we actually fully get started, I do want to know if I don't use this microphone, can everybody hear me? Like particularly those in the back, can you guys hear me okay? Cool. All right. Because I like to move around and gesture and all of that. I don't know why. I'm going to pretend like it makes me a better speaker. I don't know. Anyways, so we're here to talk about heads-up displays and how we can use heads-up and what we can learn about heads-up displays to inspire creative user interfaces or creative data visualizations. So first up, let's talk real quick a story about the history of...
Tell them who you are.
Oh, okay, yeah, it's probably a good idea. I'm going to start over since we're recording. Although it is part of the slides, but so my name is Jainan. I do mostly user experience design, but I've given this talk actually before at Big Design a couple years ago, which is where I met Randy, and we've been engaged ever since. So it's,
Conference in Addison.
yes, a wonderful design conference in Addison, and compared to other design conferences, it's dirt cheap. Tickets are a couple $100, and again, it's right here in Addison, so if you are local, you don't have to worry about necessarily getting a hotel and some of those additional expenses. And so anyways, so that's how we met, and eventually, you know, this topic seemed like it would be appropriate here as well. So again, like I said, I do user experience design, but my background is actually in game design. So I made this shift, and I've also been involved in academia, and I've been teaching a course about heads-up displays, essentially in video games, and what video game and how video games display critical information, how what they can learn from UX professionals. And this talk is sort of the opposite of that, which is what can we as UX and data visualization specialists learn from what the UX industry has already been doing, particularly around heads-up displays. So again, that's a little bit about my background and why I'm here. And I'll get into a couple more details about who I am through the presentation, but of course, who I am is less important than what I'm talking about, and hopefully what you're learning from this. So once again, since we're starting the recording, so heads-up displays, inspiring creative interfaces and creative data visualizations. All right, so we're talking about heads-up displays, so first let's talk about a story about the origin of heads-up displays. So during the 1940s, the Royal Air Force was doing research because what they had learned, a problem that they were having, is their pilots, their skilled pilots on their missions were getting distracted, missing their targets, and this was getting them exposed to the enemy, potentially costing them their lives. Right. So the Royal Air Force was working with the TRE, which is the Telecommunications Research Establishment, which works on the UK radar systems, and they were working with them and being like, fix this problem. Why are our pilots missing their targets and getting killed? Right. This is a very important problem. So what they learned in their research is that these pilots, the reason why they were getting distracted is that a lot of these missions are at night, so they're having to look out the window at the actual target they're focusing on. They're having to pay attention to this massive instrument panel, that you would expect to see in like a fighter plane, as well as getting all of this mission details and mission feedback through their earpiece. Right? It was just a lot of information. It was information overload, and so what the research that the TRE did and what they figured out is that a lot of that instrumentation panel isn't necessary to have down here. Right? I don't need to know if, say, my landing gear is up or down while I'm in the middle of this mission. Right? So what they realized is, what if we focused on just displaying that critical information? So then they basically put a display down in the instrument panel that had this critical information. Well, pilots were still getting distracted because they had to look down at this display and then look back up at the actual targets that they're looking at out of the windshield. Right? And so what they ended up figuring out is, okay, well, what if instead of putting that information on a display down here in the instrument cluster, what if we actually put that critical information on the windshield where they're already looking, right? Which allows them to basically keep their heads up, hence the term heads-up display. Now, why that matters so the quick definition of heads-up display, and we'll get back to this definition, but it's basically a display of critical information that can be seen without lowering the eyes, typically through being projected onto a windshield. Again, this idea of being able to keep your head up. Okay. So why I think this matters to us in 2018 as user experience and data visualization designers has to do with augmented reality. Right? And whether or not you think augmented reality is here to stay, the point is that there's a lot of money being put into augmented reality. We know there are very large companies like Apple that's putting a ton of money and investment into ARKit. We know Microsoft is putting a ton of money into HoloLens. And then there's also other startups and smaller companies that are amassing a ton of money, such as Magic Leap, whatever the hell that's supposed to be. But they just had a round D towards the end of last year where they raised over $500 million. Right? And they are a company devoted just to AR, VR, and mixed reality. And along with companies like LiveMap, which are creating heads-up displays for bike helmets. So in other words, there's a lot of money being put into augmented reality. So again, whether or not you think augmented reality is here to stay for the long haul, at least in the mid to short term, it's going to be important, right? Because again, there's a lot of this money that is backing this information. Now, another industry that's actually been using heads-up displays for a long time is video games. Video games have used the term heads-up displays pretty much since their inception. Games love to kind of steal terms from other mediums in order to basically, as the medium was growing. And why I'm here and I want to talk about video games, again, like I mentioned, has to do with my history. So again, I started as a game designer. So I did my bachelor's and master's at UT Dallas. I've worked on some research grants and some projects with the university. I also, we entered into a game, so the short story is we entered into a game competition. Our team took first. So our egos got the better of us, and we were like, oh, we can make $1 million on the App Store. So we took our game, we released it along with 2 other games over a couple years, and it turns out we did not make $1 million on the App Store. We were just shy of $1 million by about $1 million. You do the math, yeah. But it was a great learning experience. And one of the challenges I learned was that as a game designer, I think a lot of game designers have this problem, which is they tend to design for themselves. And I ended up making the shift sort of serendipitously towards user experience design. And that's where I was able to learn that really what's important is not me designing a solution to a problem I think is there, but really how do you figure out what a problem actually exists and then how to combine that design to solve it. So again, made the shift to user experience design. I spent a couple years with a company called TechZenit, contracted to AT&T. So spent 2 years working with a fabulous team of designers out there. Made a shift from there to a consulting company called Sogeti, where I'm at now. So Sogeti is an IT consulting company, which is part of the Capgemini group. It's sort of a like innovation arm. And so I am in the digital transformation practice, specializing again in user experience, whether that's design, visualization, research, anything related to UX, because again, if you are working in consulting, you are generally working for companies that don't necessarily have the best practices in terms of IT, so to them UX is one thing. So I can basically fill what those roles need to be. So started game design, shifted to UX design, but throughout that entire time, I've also been involved in academia. Right, so I've been teaching a variety of courses as an adjunct professor at UT Dallas in game design and user experience design. So to me, where those three things kind of intersect is in heads-up displays. So that's why I'm kind of passionate about heads-up displays and put together this presentation and want to present it to you all here. So let's go back to our definition and see how it applies to video games. Because again, this talk is about what can we learn from what the video game industry is doing successfully. So again, we're dealing with a display of critical information that can be seen without lowering your eyes, typically through being projected onto a screen. All right. But if you are a gamer, and actually how many people in here are gamers? I kind of get a sense of my audience. All right. You know, about half of you, okay, a little less than half. Great. So most gamers, once you get familiar with your controller, you're never paying attention to the controller, right? You know where the A button is, you know where the triangle button is, you know where the X button is. So if there's a prompt on screen that says, press the circle button, you're not looking down to be like, well, where's the circle button? Oh, there it is, and pressing it, right? Once you get past that initial learning curve of the new controller. So that part of the definition doesn't really make sense for video games. So let's get rid of it. So now we're dealing with a display of critical information, typically through being projected onto a screen. Sort of like this, right? So this is an on-rail shooters, which if you think like an old arcade game where you have like a gun in your hand and you're pointing at the screen and you're shooting at it, again, there's a lot of critical information that they need to display to you so they can steal your quarters. And so you have things like I've got a laser pointer here, you got your health, you've got your time, or how much time you have left, you have your big red circle indicators that are telling you this is where to shoot, and it might be a little hard to see in this picture, but there is a little yellow indicator that's also telling you kind of where you are currently shooting. Right. So this is how heads-up display sort of started, again in this arcade sort of style. But if we look at games and where games have gone since then, and we look at games that are still very similar, we have a game like this. So in Lost Planet, you still have your health bar, you still have your timer, you still have something telling you where to shoot, but there's not a giant red indicator telling you what you need to shoot. But if I were to ask you in the audience that are gamers or even non-gamers where you're supposed to shoot this thing, what are you going to say?
Right in the middle.
The glowing things on the monster, right? That stuff. And again, you don't need this giant red indicator anymore because of the fact that we are dealing with a virtual space. Because of the fact that this is a game and everything that's being rendered on screen is intentionally created by teams of artists and designers and animators, that all of this intentionality can be put into the environment and it's no longer needed to be just displayed on the screen. And you're still getting that critical information. So once again, if we look at that definition and we say it's a display of critical information through being projected onto a screen, that's no longer true either. So really what we're going to be talking about is just a display of critical information. And what we're going to be looking at mostly is the work that these two gentlemen have done, this master's thesis, and I'm going to say their names, I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to say it just for the sake of giving them credit, but Eric Fagerholt and Magnus Lorentzen. So this was something they came up with years ago called Beyond the HUD, User Interfaces for Increased Player Immersion in First-Person Shooter Games. I know some of you are taking pictures. I will be posting the slide share and there will be a video, so the link to their actual thesis, if you want to dive into it, will be available to you. But anyway, so again, about 10 years ago, what was really important to games was about immersion and how do you get players immersed. And so that's what they were doing their research on. And they were focused solely on first-person shooters. So first-person shooters, these are the type of games, this is like Call of Duty or Halo, to where all you're really seeing is like the gun or the weapon of the player. You're not really seeing the character. That's called a first-person shooter, as opposed to a third-person shooter like Uncharted or Gears of War, where you are actually seeing your character on screen. So again, that's what they were looking at, and they came up with a brilliant model that I think if we extrapolate just beyond first-person shooters, and we apply it to games, and we apply it to augmented reality and user interfaces and data visualizations as a whole, I think there's a lot we can learn from. But again, we are going to be looking at primarily what the work that they've done. So this is going to be a fairly academic talk. So as we go through this model, if you have questions, as you have them, please go ahead and ask them. Of course, there'll be time at the end for questions as well. But as we start getting into some headier topics, please just raise your hand or shout to me that you want a little bit more clarification. Okay, so through their research, when they were looking at what separates a real-life HUD versus a video game HUD, they were basically two things that they've learned, right? So again, if you think about a real HUD, like here in this airplane, to where what you have control of is basically the green, all the green data here, compared to a game, which is also even if you are in a cockpit, everything here is being rendered by the screen, right? So through their research, there was basically two key things that separated a video game heads-up display from a real-world heads-up display. The first thing is narrative. All games have a narrative. You can kind of say the word story, but a little bit more generic term is the word narrative. And this applies to all games, right? Even Tetris is this weird Russian game about stacking blocks, right? There's still some sort of a narrative fantasy or fiction surrounding that game, okay? The second thing is virtual space. Like I mentioned, everything is being rendered intentionally, right? There's nothing put to chance, and there's nothing that is showing up that no one knows exists that's showing up, right? So that gives us the virtual space, and again, this is different than the real world, in which you don't have control over how the real world looks. So with that, we can basically start to formulate a chart by basically thinking about whether or not this, again, display of critical information is in the narrative or out of the narrative, and whether it's in the virtual space or out of the virtual space. So this is what's going to give us our 4 quadrants. Now, to help us kind of conceptualize where different critical UI components sort of exist on this chart, the cheat sheet I like to use is this idea of the 4th wall. So the 4th wall, that's a term that comes from theater. So in theater, you have this idea that, again, if you were having an intimate conversation between two characters into a bedroom, then you want the audience to be immersed in the bedroom, right? You don't want to acknowledge the fact that you are in a giant theater of 100 people, right? So that's why even when characters are delivering a monologue, they're never delivering a monologue to the audience. They're always looking past the audience and just delivering their monologue out into the ether, right? And again, it's because this idea that you don't want to break that 4th wall, that sense of immersion, right? And again, this is typically, of course, there are examples of media that intentionally break the 4th wall. Of course, like a movie like, say, Deadpool. So I'm super excited about Deadpool 2. So if you are familiar with the character of Deadpool, he's a comic book superhero who is very self-referential. He's always self-aware that he's in a comic book and always making jokes about the fact that he's in a comic book, or he's making jokes that he's in a movie. If you've seen the movie, he will directly address the audience. And, kind of playing with cliches. So again, there are intentional ways to break this 4th wall, but again, think about the 4th wall as this thing that is separating what's happening in the similitude of the space versus not, right? What's happening in our real world. Okay, so how we can apply the 4th wall narratively is basically, can the characters perceive it? So that's the question you want to ask to determine this answer of where it's going to fit. So can the characters perceive it? Again, if the characters can perceive it, then it's in the narrative. So what'd you say?
What is it?
The UI component, whatever the information that you're trying to display. So because a HUD is made up of multiple UI components, so it's not like the HUD as a whole is going to be in each of these quadrants. Each individual component can be in these quadrants. So good clarification, yeah. So it is basically any critical information you're trying to display. So again, can the characters perceive it? Are the characters in that fantasy, in that fiction, aware of whatever this thing is or not? Right? And then in terms of the virtual space the question we want to ask is, does it appear on the screen or within the screen? So again, the fourth wall of the virtual space is essentially your monitor, right? It's your monitor, it's this projector. So it's this idea of whatever the component is it being presented to you on the screen, taking into account the fact that we're dealing with this 16:9 aspect ratio, all of that, or is it being presented essentially within the screen, so to speak, but basically as part of and taking into account the actual virtual geometry that exists in these worlds, right? If you think virtual reality as well as video games here.
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part.
So and we'll look at examples and I think it'll help, but basically, is it taking into account the actual virtual space? Is it moving with objects in the virtual space? Or is it relative to the actual screen? So there is a component that, say, is always going to be in the top left corner. And it's always 50 pixels from the top left and 50 pixels from the very top. So it's in that corner, and no matter what, however the angle changes, it's always stuck to that area. Right? So that is basically then on the screen because it's focused on that fourth wall, the literal wall being your display, versus again taking into account the geometry, which is outlining something, say, in the actual world, to where as that object is moving around, this information is moving along with it. Does that make sense? Cool. Yes?
Is it like UI versus content?
Yes. So kind of like UI versus content. But again, as we saw with that Lost Planet example, that line is blurred. And that's sort of what we want to talk about, is this idea that within the content, you can embed these critical information, like, say, where you're supposed to shoot the giant monster. Okay, so, like I said, we're getting pretty academic here. So, let's talk about the first quadrant I want to talk about is down here, which is out of the narrative and out of the virtual space. So again, the characters aren't aware of it, and it's not taking into account the virtual space. This we're going to call non-diegetic. Well, now you're probably like, what is this random buzzword that you're throwing at me? Called diegetic. So diegesis is a term that comes from film. And it's this, again, this idea of, are the characters aware of it or not? And it was used a lot to apply to sound and music. So, if you think back to like pretty much every 80s high school rom-com ever, to where there's always a climax at like the school dance. And so a lot of times you have the music and you can hear it kind of echoing as if it's being presented in the actual gymnasium where the dance is, in a way that the characters can perceive it. But then at some point it might cut to some sort of montage where it's showing the locker room or the hallway or something else, and now the music is just playing in the speakers, but it's just playing for us to hear it. And the actual characters in that scene aren't necessarily aware of it. Right? So it's sort of like, if you think, say, Lord of the Rings, has the beautiful Howard Shore score, there's not like a 60-piece orchestra following the hobbits as they're running through Isengard, right? That music is just for us, the audience, right? So that music then is non-diegetic. But say in some of the scenes when the characters are like singing in the pub, that of course they're all hearing, and that becomes then diegetic. So that's where this term comes from. So again, non-diegetic as this term is essentially outside of the space and the similitude of the world. So let's look at some examples. So the first one here, so in Batman, right, Batman is this stealth detective, and so in here you have these indicators like a health indicator and your little compass, and this health indicator is again stuck to that top left corner, right? So again, it is not taking into account the virtual space. It's always in that top left corner of the screen, and it's also presenting health in these very like discrete bars, which is not in a way that the characters are really perceiving. It's not like Batman is like, oh, I just got shot by a bullet. I am now at 2 bars out of 8 bars of health left. Right? So again, that's, presenting information that is just for us as the audience, right, in a way that the characters aren't perceiving. Same way with the compass. There's not a giant compass over Batman's head telling him where to go. That would make him a pretty shitty stealth person if all of a sudden there's this big glowing thing telling people, hey, Batman is coming to you. Right? So again, that becomes these non-diegetic information, right? Again, this compass and this health. Another example here from Mass Effect. So you have like your ammo indicator, and you have your gun with little icon showing you, what weapon your character is holding, along with how much ammo you have and how much ammo you currently have in the clip. But once again, even if there might be something, say, on the actual gun itself, that component here in the bottom left, that's just for us. And there's not this component telling the character how much ammo he has hanging out of his butt. right? That's just for us. So even the information in the middle, it's presenting us information that even if the character might be aware of it to some degree, it's being presented to us, for our benefit. So like, for example, you have these are called cooldowns, which are basically indicators of your squad mates here who are not on screen. It's to tell you whether or not they're able to perform one of their cool maneuvers, right? So, but again, it's not like the characters are thinking, okay, in 3 seconds I'll be able to jump again, right? This is a display of that information presented to us, the player and the audience, so that we can perceive that information. So again, that's non-diegetic. If we look at a non-game example, right, we can look at, say, a scoreboard that you see when you're watching sports. Now, of course, there is an actual scoreboard that's, generally in most of these stadiums, but this particular display here with, the NBC logo and telling you, Boston and Washington and, third period, that again is static to the middle of the screen, right? And its size is static. So whether or not you're looking at a wider angle of the field or cuts to a close-up of a particular player, that display is always there in the top for us, right? So again, it's not always hanging over the head of these characters, right? It is just, at least in this representation, it is just for us, right? Non-diegetic. Again, it is out of the narrative, characters can't perceive it, and out of the virtual space, right? So it's not taking into account the actual world, virtual or real, and it's just focused on the actual, whatever the display resolution and or aspect ratio is. The opposite of that is diegetic, right? So again, now the characters can perceive it, and it is part of those characters' world. So this is one of my favorite examples here. So in Mario 64, when Mario's health is low, he starts panting, right? So Mario 64 does also feature a more non-diegetic conventional health indicator. It has this little pie chart that's cut into 6 or 8 quadrants to let you know a little bit more precisely how much health you have. But without needing to see that component, you can see just through the animation of the character that your health is low. And so the player instinctually knows that my health is low, and now the character is behaving differently and playing differently because of the fact that information is being presented to them where they're looking. So their behavior is changing, and we've given them critical information that they need to play the game through the environment without needing to have this little pie indicator, in the top left corner. Right? That's the power of some of these diegetic interfaces, is this ability to display this information relative to exactly what the characters are experiencing. Another example here, so Dead Space was famous for this as well. So Dead Space is this survival horror game. So it was all about trying to scare you, essentially. It's an action game as well, but they wanted you to scare, they wanted you to have that excitement, so their goal was to keep you immersed. They were like, we don't want to distract you with information that's going to pull you away from the world. In which case, then all of the jump scares and things that they wanted to showcase wouldn't be as effective. So a lot of the components you need to play this game is built into the environment. So for example, you have the weapon indicator here that tells you, oh, I've got 10 bullets left in the gun. Now, the character, Isaac, is also seeing that indicator, right? That display is for him. And again, it is taking into account the virtual world, meaning if you rotate the camera and you block your view of that screen on that gun, you've blocked your view of that screen on that gun. You don't know how much ammo you have, right? And again, it is taking into account the virtual space. Right? So again, Dead Space was doing this for a lot of its components. Some more successfully than others. For example, like this indicator here was telling you sort of your health and your shield and stasis sort of indicators. Again, doesn't quite make sense in the real fiction of the world. The player's not really, or the character, Isaac, isn't going to be like, how much health do I have? I'm going to try and look behind him. But again, they were intentionally trying to put it in a way that, yes, we can see it as the audience, but is also being presented as part of the environment, right? That other characters and creatures in the game are also seeing that same display. Right. If we again look at a non-game example, we can look at something like Matteo, which was a company that was actually acquired by Apple a couple years ago. So here they're trying to, you can see in this example that they are basically showing you, what the color of this car could be. But the way that they're showing you that is not this color picker that tells you I want a mint color or seafoam green or whatever. It's showcasing that color on the actual car as if it was actually there, right? How it would actually look. So again, they're trying to showcase that this is how other people in the world would see your car, right, if it was colored this way. So again, the people in the world can perceive it, would be able to perceive the color this way. As well as, again, it is taking into account the geometry, because again, it is actually being presented on the car itself, as opposed to, some sort of conventional, radio button type selection picker. Right. So again, this becomes diegetic. It's in the virtual space, taking into account the geometry, and in the narrative, meaning other characters or people in that universe, real or otherwise, are aware of it. Okay, so now let's get into the more tricky ones. So the first one I want to talk about is in the top right, and that is in the virtual space, but out of the narrative. Okay, so it is aware of the virtual geometry of the world, but the characters aren't able to perceive that component. Okay. We're going to call this spatial. It's a spatial component. And an example here, if you look in StarCraft, you have these rings that are circling your units. Right? So you have these rings telling you what's been selected, along with some other indicator such as a health. Right? Now those indicators will move with these units. As these units move around the battlefield, these rings and that bar is going to move with those units. As you zoom out, it will shrink. As you zoom in, it grows. So it is now relative to some of the geometry in the world. Right? That's what makes this spatial. Again, but there's not these glowing rings underneath these actual units. Right? That ring is just for us, the player, and the audience to see and have that representation of that important information, like who's been selected and how much health these units have. Right? So again, the actual units on the screen aren't aware of these rings. Right? That's what makes it not part of the narrative, but again, it is taking into account how they are moving, where they are, how they are moving around the actual virtual space and the environment. So it's in the virtual space. Again, that's what makes that spatial. Another example, so a lot of games are starting to do this, where you have a trail telling you where your pathway is supposed to go, right? And so some do it with a non-diegetic, sort of just like a little pointer telling you go this way generically, that way or this way. But a lot of games are actually putting a path as it relates to the geometry, right? And again, so this blue line that's telling you you're going straight, you'll actually see it curve behind a building if you need to make a left turn. Right, so again, and it will be blocked by those buildings because it's turning and it's following that line, right? But again, this is information for us, the player and the audience. The characters in the world aren't necessarily perceiving it, right? This NPC or non-player character isn't aware that there's this blue line on the ground, right? So they aren't aware of this information, but again, it is taking into account how the world is actually structured, moving around buildings, following the pathway, going up over a hill and down a crescent. And so again, in the narrative, or in the virtual space, not in the narrative. Even if we look outside of games, we have this example here where if you're watching football, you always have, you have where the line of scrimmage is, you have where the first down line is, and so that's basically the target of where these players are trying to get to. But again, and so these lines are being projected onto the screen for us, right? And it will move with the screen. So if it's on, the 29-yard line, it will always be on the 29-yard line, even as the camera is panning around and cutting and moving around. But again, there's not an actual blue line on the ground for these players. Right? The players conceptually understand that this is their line of scrimmage, but there's not an actual line telling them, hey, don't cross this line. Right? So again, that becomes a spatial component or spatial information that is being displayed, taking into account the world, but that the actual people in the world aren't aware of it. So once again, this is spatial. Again, in the virtual space, out of the narrative. Now the final quadrant is probably the trickiest, which is why I saved it for last. So again, this is now the characters can perceive it, but it's not taking into account the virtual space. Right? And so that we're going to call meta. So if we look at, and I'll pause here for just a moment, I think people are taking a screen image here. All right, so meta being in the narrative and out of the virtual space, we get something like this UI in Doom. And what I really want to focus on is this indicator right here of your character's health, right? Which is a display of your character's face and how bloody they are, which represents how much health you have. Again, there is a non-diegetic information that's telling you that you do have actual 11% health, but you are also getting this indicator here. Now, once again, this indicator here, it is static to the screen in the sense that it is always in the bottom center of the screen, right? So it's not taking into account the virtual world. It's always located, locked in that location, but it is the way that it is a representation of what it actually exists like. So presumably, all these characters are seeing your face this bloody, right? Presumably, you could look in a mirror and see that your face is this bloody, right? So again, it is in a way that the characters are perceiving it, but it's being presented for us to make it easier in a way that, again, we can see it, so it's always static in one place. Right? Because it would be very frustrating to play this game if to know how much health you had to go find a mirror and look at it to see how bloody your face was. Right? So that's why they have this information there. Another example, if we, go ahead.
We call those indicators non-diegetic.
So these indicators would be non-diegetic. The ammo, the health, your armor percentage, you are right. Those are non-diegetic. This indicator right here is what we're talking about as meta. Just that one.
So that's diegetic meta.
Yes, so this is just meta, right? So diegetic would be something like you have feedback that you've successfully shot that character there because of the fact that they've got this animation and they're bleeding, which actually is critical information for the player. But again, so that's diegetic because again it is these actual creatures that are bleeding that the other creatures are perceiving. Then you have this component again is a representation of what other characters could see, but it's on the screen, not within the screen, so it's just for us. Right. Another example, if we look at Grand Theft Auto, you have an indicator, so the menu system is a phone of what the character has. And you can see that it is the same phone, right? You can even see what's highlighted, that the context is currently highlighted, and that if I wanted to look at, say, messages, I would move, to the top left, and you could see that the character would move it to the top left. But again, this is a meta component, because again, it is a representation of what the character is actually perceiving, but it's being presented for us, right? Because again, it would be very frustrating to manipulate the UI if we had to somehow manipulate the camera to look over the character's shoulder at their actual phone. So what the developers and designers and artists did was put a representation of that exactly the way that the character is perceiving it on the screen for us to see. The closest thing I could think of in terms of a non-game example with like the real world would be something like this display of cards in if you've ever seen any poker tournaments. So oftentimes you'll see the actual cards that the different players have once they open it. So they'll cut the camera to the player and they'll open it and they'll be like, oh, 9 of spades, 9 of hearts, and then that will display in this UI component that again is locked to this part of the screen. No matter how the camera cuts, could be a close-up of the player, could be showing you the field, it could be the dealer, whatever it is, that information is static to the bottom left, right? But it is representative of what the characters are perceiving. And the ones that do it the best, for example, use like say art assets that represent the actual art assets on the ground. So if they're using a blue bicycle, playing card deck, then what you would actually see is the backs of the blue bicycle playing card deck until that player looks at their cards, and then it flips over and you are looking at it and you are looking at what looks like that card. Right? So again, it is a representation of what the characters are perceiving, but again, it is for us to see in a way that again is not just in the virtual space, but is being presented on the screen, not within the screen for us. Okay. So again, that's meta. So once again, we have these four quadrants here, and we're gonna move on to some applications as well and some observations. But what I want to point out at this point is don't get too caught up in the semantics of these words. Right? Again, this is a very academic diagram, and so if you are trying to apply an academic diagram, don't get too caught up in where a component sort of exists. Oh, is this meta? Is it non-diegetic? That's less important than realizing that you are in the out of virtual space component, right? And then maybe what you need to do as you are thinking about how to conceptualize your UI or your data visualization is what if I try to make it more in the virtual space? Right? Again, if we're thinking augmented reality here. So again, that's where you could then start thinking and sort of thinking more creatively, which is the purpose, right? Okay, so let's look at a couple key observations. And so again, this is just two things that I've noticed, again, having researched this and having presented this same presentation to various students that are looking into and are being inspired by video game designs. So the first one is why not diegetic? The first thing I always hear after I start talking about this, this model is all of the students tend to be like, oh, then that means the goal is diegetic, right? Because if our goal is to keep players immersed, then obviously then the best solution and the best UI would be one that is totally diegetic. Right? And my response to that is this. So here you have a UI of Assassin's Creed. Now one of the things that's really interesting about Assassin's Creed, particularly the older games, which I think did this better than some of the newer iterations in the franchise, you can actually go into the menu, and they have in the menu, they list out everything that you would think of as a traditional heads-up display, like this ammo indicator and this mini-map indicator, and you can turn all of it off. You can turn all of it off, and you can still play the game. Why? Because every bit of critical information that you need is being presented somehow in the environment. Right? You can see the feedback that the characters are giving, you can hear the noises, you can follow certain tracks. So all of this information, like what weapon you have selected, your character holds out the weapon they have selected. Right? You can see how much health you have by how the character is moving. All of this information is being presented diegetically. So then the question becomes, if the goal is diegetic, and you can play Assassin's Creed diegetically by turning off all these HUD components, why, when you start up the game, do you see all these HUD components? Any thoughts? While I take a swig of water.
Just put the block, because they have played 100 games. The first time they see the screen, they don't see the indicator. They're going to think the game is broken.
They're going to think the game is broken. Right? They're not going to see an indicator. They're going to be like, how the heck am I supposed to do anything? Yeah.
Is that an expert mode?
So yeah, you could arguably say in a lot of games it becomes a sort of expert mode. So what makes it expert mode is the fact that essentially it's harder. Right? It is harder to play the game if you are doing it in this diegetic fashion by turning off all of these HUD components. Right? As these two gentlemen mentioned, right? It becomes harder. New people that are looking at it are going to look at it and be totally confused because it's going to be a lot harder to convey what it is that the critical components are. So again, even though you could go in and turn it off and you could make every component diegetic, what you're going to do is you're generally going to make your UI more immersive, but at the cost of usability. And so you are generally, the more non-diegetic your components are, generally the higher usability it becomes. Right? Similarly with the meta and spatial, similarly you have the same thing, right? Because if we think back at like that Doom example, again, that information of how your health is displayed, they intentionally chose to put that information here for us, right? For the audience, to make it easier for us, to make it higher usability for us. Of course, it takes away from your immersion because now you have this bar of information that is pulling you out of the actual world and the experience. The second observation that I think is important to make is this idea of what I'm going to call shifting the fourth wall. So again, if the fourth wall is what's separating the in versus the out, then what we've seen a lot in a lot of games recently is they sort of shift that to, again, try and move a bit more to that higher immersion without sacrificing usability. So if we look at Halo versus Halo 4, to where now in Halo 4 you are actually looking at the visor of the character. Right, so they've literally shifted that projected screen and are saying, well, that projected screen is actually part of the virtual space and we're going to show you that projected screen on your own screen. Right? And so if we compare the two, you can see that Halo 4 becomes a bit more immersive because you do feel like you are wearing this helmet, and you are more like the Master Chief, who is the main character in the Halo franchise, compared to in Halo 2. But I would argue you are sacrificing a bit of the usability. Now, if we ignore a little bit of the contrast issues with the Halo 2 screenshot to the Halo 4 screenshot, you have, say, like the weapon indicator that's slightly at an angle, which we know as like a design principle around orientation sensitivity makes it a little bit harder to see. You also know that you are wasting a lot of room on the actual display itself with just information to try and make it look like it's more diegetic. Right, which I would argue is also, you are sacrificing a bit of the usability. But they are doing this to, again, try and make it more diegetic. Again, to varying degrees of success. For example, I don't think that the Master Chief has an indicator in a critical part of his field of view telling him what gun he's holding. pretty sure he's aware of what weapon he's holding. So I would still argue that that's not a diegetic component. But again, this idea is you can at least try and move along that spectrum of non-diegetic to diegetic by shifting this fourth wall. Yes.
Back to that.
Oh.
So why do you think they displayed a picture of the gun? Because even the user can see what guns he's holding.
So I think it's immersive. I really do, right? Because you are seeing that weapon. You can see the feedback of that weapon. There was a video game called Black, which was made by I think Criterion, which are the people that made Burnout. Which, if you ever played Burnout, is a racing game to where cars are exploding all the time in 1,000 million pieces, and it's supposed. Think Michael Bay. If Michael Bay were to make a video game, it would be this. So one of the things that they decided to do in this game is they actually had the cartridges of the weapon eject towards the screen, right? Which, if anyone in here is familiar with firearms, would know that would be incredibly stupid because you are basically throwing burning hot metal at your face, right? But they intentionally did it because they thought it looked cool, because now they have this cool animation of all of the cartridge shells flying at the screen. So I would argue that it's for that immersion. But I do think that you do get at least some level of nice design in the sense, let me go back here, to where you do have this nice, beautiful line literally pointing you to where you're aiming. So I think it could help you kind of target as well. But I think that's really why.
But if they have the gun image, which I like, why have this silhouette in the top right corner? Because even the user can see what gun.
I agree. I just think that you could argue that, again, because you are dealing at this perspective angle and some of the guns look similar, that you might not realize, am I looking at the alien pistol or the alien rifle, because the butt of the gun looks so similar.
I think it's going to be because of persistence, there's weapon selection. So if you select that weapon, there's going to be a slight delay and whether you're going to select it or not. Now, if you all of a sudden just popped up a new weapon up there, it would be very distracting and would take you out of that UI. Whereas there's
great point.
Something there's static, and it's just selecting out, and it's just a peripheral channel. So I think it's a little bit thinking about, where fourth wall disappears or not, and whether you continue that immersion or not. So I think even within that, even within an immersive environment, it looks like those other components still are relevant.
Yeah, and that's the balance then you have to strike. This is why design is design, and it's an art form as well as a science, is you have to decide as a data visualizer and as a user experience interface designer where on the spectrum you want to sit. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else had a comment to make. Yes?
One of the things is, you won't see it on the screen, but when you pick up a weapon in the game, a lot of times the weapons are on the ground. So when you walk over it, you will get an icon on the screen with that same icon on the top right. And that lets you know exactly which weapon you're standing on top of. Because if you didn't have that icon, you would actually have to look down at it. And when you're using a controller, oftentimes looking down is a tedious task. So by having that icon there, it makes it much easier to tell what weapon you're standing over if you're trying to change something from on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, right? So I do think that this is a necessary component for us as the player. Right, I do think so, right? Which is why I think they included it, while otherwise it's a fairly minimalist HUD, heads-up display compared to other video games. But yeah, so once again, it's just this idea of where on that spectrum do you want to lie? And again, trying to do tricks to try and push you one way or another, even though you're really not moving along that spectrum too much, like this idea of shifting the fourth wall. Okay, so let's look at a quick application example before we wrap up here, and let's talk about navigation. And again, how navigation would apply to augmented reality, user interfaces and whatnot, and how this model applies. So the first one I want to talk about is, of course, a non-diegetic way of displaying turn-by-turn navigation. And I want to talk specifically about turn-by-turn navigation, which is, again, displaying relevant information to you at the moment you need it. Right? Like a heads-up display should do, is, again, a display of critical information. Not all information, the critical information to you at that moment. So if you look at something like Google Glass, to where it has this, has a display in the top right corner, and it's basically just giving you a representation of a map that's, it's very graphical in the sense that it's trying to be very horizontal, very vertical, 45-degree angles to make it very highly usable. But again, there's nothing related to the actual environment there. Right, so yes, you have to make this turn, but it's not necessarily following the curve of the turn. There's obviously not a blue line on the ground. All of the stuff that you are seeing in this display doesn't exist in the actual world, right? They're using a particular font that's not the Clearview font that's probably being used by the actual road marker. So again, they are intentionally not using elements of the virtual space. And again, no other people are going to be seeing this similar layout of how you are moving through the environment, right? No other person that's on a bike would be able to see that same, this representation of the world. So this is a non-diegetic way of displaying the information. And once again, this is Google, right? So I'm not trying to say that non-diegetic is bad, right? And in fact, the opposite, because again, it is highly usable, which is what they were after. So don't think that I need to move my UI from one of these quadrants into another. It's just think about the benefits and the pros and cons of each of these corners. So again, this is Google and this is Google Glass with their non-diegetic way of displaying turn-by-turn navigation. Compared to something like this, which is a concept by BMW, to where they are trying to, again, this sort of the same sort of blue line. Now they are trying to move it more spatially, which is again in the virtual space, but again not in the narrative, meaning that they are actually trying to follow the geometry of the world, right? So you can see how this line is actually following the sidewalk, so you can actually follow this path a little bit more clearly, again a bit more spatially. But again, this is this blue line with this white outline, and you know, these people that are walking and crossing the street, they're not seeing this blue line. They're not aware of it. So again, it is out of that narrative space, right? Narrative in this case being the real world, okay? But again, it is spatial, taking into account and following the geometry of the world. If we think meta, this is as close as I could really kind of think about, which is Tomtom, which is kind of like a Garmin, which is just like a little screen that you can have, just like if you were to use navigation on your phone back in the day. But what they did in their display is they tried to show you what the actual road looks like, including what the buildings are. Granted, it's a fairly low fidelity representation of it, but they're actually trying to show you, hey, this is exactly how long you have as far as to move over into the exit lane. This is how steep that angle is as you are taking that exit lane. This is how many lanes there are, how big the merge is. All of this information as if it was actually there, right? You even have the road sign. And again, they're trying to present it like the green road sign that is actually telling you, hey, this is the Fayetteville Road exit. Right. So again, this is a meta example because again, they're trying to show it that other people, this is what they were looking at. They are seeing 3 lanes, they are seeing a guardrail, they are seeing a sign here, but it's presented to us, right? This screen, that indicator there that's telling you the road, that is again static to the top right of this Tomtom display, right? So again, that is just for us, but it is representative of exactly supposedly how that road sign actually looks. Right. So that leaves us with diegetic. And the honest truth is, I don't know what a good diegetic augmented reality turn-by-turn navigation is. Right? And if we think, yes, there are turn markers that exist, but there's tons of turn markers, right? And most of those aren't relevant to me. If I'm in a car, I don't need to know that a truck needs to make an exit over here, right? Or that the truck speed is this. I don't need to know that the bike lane is here if I'm not in a bike, right? I need to know my speed. I need to know where I need to turn. I know I'm turning left. I don't need to know where the right-hand turn lane is. So I don't know what a diegetic version of a turn-by-turn navigation would look like. And that's where I'm really going to leave it because maybe there's a brilliant visualizer in here that can think about that, right? But really the point I want to make as you kind of think about this, and if you have ideas, I'd love to hear it as we break for the Q&A, but is to think about this model. And again, this is an academic model, so don't get, again, too caught up in the semantics. But the point is that if you think about where your UI or your visualization currently lives on this model, and you're stumped, you're like, I don't know where to take this model. How do I make it more immersive? How do I make it more usable? Then maybe you can use this model to think about, here's where I am. Let me look at the other quadrants where I'm not and start exploring solutions in that space. And I'm hoping that using this model will inspire you to have creative user interfaces and creative data visualizations. Thank you. Now I will open it up to questions. Yes?
All right, so I actually did narrative design or game writing before I started whatever I do now. And one of the things that they talked about was the struggle of doing narrative in VR games because of the user interface in it. What they were finding is like anytime they put words, whether it was static, they'd miss it, or if they put it relative to wherever the player was looking, it caused sickness. Do you think there's a way of sort of fixing that?
That's a good question. So, I mean, because I think motion sickness is like this huge problem with VR in general.
Yeah.
I almost think then, I think in that sense, perhaps something like a spatial component might be good, or just some sort of indicator to let you know that here's information you need, and this is, and interact with something, press a button or something to pull up that information. Because I almost think then you need to get rid of that information if you're dealing with a virtual space, right? You need to then, because yeah, I mean, it would be distracting if you are trying to be immersed in a world and you're trying to make it look like the real world, and then now you're getting something that would obviously not be in the real world, like giant text or on the wall or something. So I don't really know, other than saying you probably then shouldn't have that information. You should then maybe be thinking more diegetic, and maybe in VR, if you're trying to display text, displaying text more diegetically might actually be the more usable experience. It's the only thing I could really think. Yeah, good question. I know that Randy and I have had a discussion over lunch, and so where I think augmented reality would be moving in terms of how you communicate information would be you use the environment to help you organize, but then once you get somewhere, you display the information non-diegetically, because non-diegetic tends to be the more usable. So the idea is, if you think like, if you've watched like the BBC Sherlock, how Sherlock goes into his mind map in his brain, I almost think the same sort of thing could work. Like in my home right now, like my fiance moved in, so I don't know where anything is, but I generally have a sense of where it might be. So I know like the pots and pans are somewhere in the kitchen. So if I'm looking for information about pots and pans, I would go to the kitchen. And then if I wanted to read a recipe, I would want to then read it on just the screen in a highly usable way, as opposed to doing some weird on a desk, having to like physically look over it, because I think people are inherently lazy and wouldn't want to do that. But basically that's where I think that information would go, is that you wouldn't then have this text on screen. You would basically have indicators to tell you where to go to, so that that text can be presented to you in a non-diegetic way, in a way you're more used to.
One of the concepts I've heard explored is a contextual character. So think about like something like a smartwatch or something would be your contextual character. And so it would use your sound design, because, anytime you hear it buzzing out of the left-hand side, or even have a haptic feedback of actually having the bracelet and give you haptic feedback to say, hey, pay attention to this, and then to extend. But you have to address it as a third character. You can also have a fairy floating around that might flitter in and say, hey, look over here, and it would flash and then buzz off, and you have to look where it was to see the sign. So there's this idea behind a character, maybe it's a dog, maybe it's a pet, but using these third facial reference characters essentially is one of the aspects that I've seen to solve that. That's not the only reason I've seen so far. I'm sure there's more brilliant ways to do it.
Cool, that's good.
A couple of questions. That's a different conversation.
I'll add, I'm working on a new talk about the best practices of visualizing data in a VR or AR environment. So I would talk to a guy at Microsoft working on HoloLens, specifically about text.
Yeah.
If you're working with HoloLens, you're familiar with HoloLens. It's the big head unit, and it's the entire computer. So there's no cord or anything like that. The entire computer is this head unit. And so they have put in their design best practices that you shouldn't display text like really close to the user. Number one, the screen is right here, right? So anybody who's starting to have vision issues, like you need to wear reading glasses or something, you actually have a hard time seeing VR because it's right here. And so in their best practices, they say don't display any text any closer than 3 feet. So perceptually 3 feet away from you is as close as any text that you want to be readable should be displayed within the environment. And farther away is more comfortable and is less likely to cause any kind of motion sickness the farther away it is.
Those are Microsoft standards or recommendations?
Yeah, so that's part of their design guide for HoloLens applications.
Very cool.
Are there like any open source tools around this area of like augmented reality? I know there's HUDs here in mind, especially for marketing personalization. Like if you want to see the world or see a restaurant as to how a user would perceive it, this would be pretty amazing to be able to,
Unity.
right?
Unity is
Unity.
open source.
It's open source. What a lot of game developers use. It has VR components, and it can also transfer to like all platforms. So Unity is probably one of the programs you're going to look at.
Yep.
WebVR is another one. A lot of people are moving for WebVR. It's also very open language design, immersive experiences.
And I know there's a lot of folks here in the DFW area that are a fan of ARKit, because that's Apple's tool and platform that they're using, because they're
So easy to use.
pushing it
Yeah.
on. So that's a great one too. Cool. Yeah.
Do you see any applicability outside of virtual reality or augmented reality as it relates to displaying data?
So, I mean, outside of AR and VR, I think it becomes tricky, just because then what becomes the fourth wall of the virtual space? I think perhaps still thinking about the fourth wall of the of like the narrative and the fantasy might be cool, right? In the sense that if you say are working for, Southwest Airlines, and you wanted to showcase what a boarding pass looked like on a display, maybe you have the boarding pass look like the actual physical boarding pass, so you get that mental map and that connection. So again, you are sort of thinking about the narrative a bit, as far as that fantasy, but as far as your component wouldn't necessarily change based off of any virtual space that I can think of.
We do see a lot outside of VR and AR, which is really just social media graphics and even presentation design, where you're using photos. So you have a photo backdrop, and you're putting text in a chart or a visualization on top of it.
That's
You
true.
got to decide, is that just for the audience, or do you want to put it into context and you try and
That's a
put
great point.
pointers or something where it looks like it's actually in the environment?
So what about those games that you see children, like they display, they have what do they call these? They have the projectors up top and they have it projecting down, and the kids are moving around.
The stuff that Spacey's working on, and it's
Yeah, I was about to
interactive.
say Spacey,
Yep.
because he has some things where they were projecting onto a car, the engines
Yep.
and things like that. Yeah, would you call that augmented reality, or would those be diegetic? That, or meta, or one of those things in the...
I guess it's probably some sort of like mixed reality trying to make it augmented reality.
Yeah,
Yep.
Mixed reality is
It's a
starting to come up.
projected augmented reality.
Yeah, the projected augmented reality. So because you're essentially now shifting the fourth wall from just what I can perceive as someone wearing this headset to now it is part of the environment and everybody can see it. So I think, yeah, it's trying to move, it's a more diegetic AR experience by making it mixed reality, MR.
It's almost like putting a projector on the hood of your car, right? And you could project with the direction so that everybody sees them, but nobody's doing that.
Yeah.
I'm not projecting I'm going to turn right the next light or whatever. It's just for me.
Yeah, yeah. I think back to your question, I was thinking a bit more. I mean, I think we did see a little bit as far as UIs trying to be a bit more spatial with a lot of like parallax effect that was really popular a couple years ago. So I think in that, which if you're not familiar with parallax, that's where you have different layers of the background. And so like as you scroll, say the text scrolls at a different rate than the background, and you could layer that as much as possible, as much as you wanted in order to, communicate things. So like, I know Apple had a really cool site where they would take their cool cylinder iMac and basically blow it out as you started scrolling. So it would basically zoom out and it would show you the components, and then it would zoom into a component and then read you the information. And,
It is.
oh yeah, all this cool
Love that
stuff. Yeah. So I think there is stuff, and I'm trying to think like with parallax. I feel like that became a fad. Like it was cool for a while, and then now it's gone because I think there were some usability issues with it. But that's not to say some of those couldn't still be solved. Yeah.
It's more of a UX question. If I had like 2 weeks to learn UX, is there like a good resource to read? All I'm saying is like, is there something that at least tells me this is what it is and this is what it's not, sort of thing, right? Like, it's a good introduction course,
So-
not like 6 months.
So I think the two most important, so in the short term of learning UX, I think the most important thing is learning usability, right? Because 90% of the time what I'm doing is just, this is not, people are not aware of this. Let us make it more aware. Let us make sure that our contrasts are high. So look at like the Baymard Institute, which is one. Nielsen Norman Group is another. UIE is another. If you just, there's a lot of articles. If you just look up like usability.
A course on Meetup also, which is better.
Yeah, I'm sure there's.
The course that Brian teaches.
Yeah. What is it?
Brian Sullivan teaches I don't know, is it 6?
I think it's 6 weeks.
6 weeks through Cape. He and Jay Shu and Preston,
Yeah.
they teach a really good UX intro course for 6 weeks.
Yeah. So it's 6 weeks. Breaks your little
Not
2 week
2 weeks.
line, but it's 6 weeks. So I think short
Like
term.
mine, it's an evening course, you know, so it's once a week for 6 weeks.
Well,
And then-
school time is 6 weeks.
Right. True.
I'm not saying it's a 1 hour.
Right.
Yeah, so I would say, again, short-term usability, long-term psychology. Long-term, you really need to know basically human behavior. Why do we do the things we do? Like what
We mentioned it earlier, go to the big design conference.
big design conference.
2
Hey,
days.
that's 2 days, less than 2 weeks.
days.
Yeah,
You will just absorb so much you won't believe it.
yeah.
That's a question. Have you ever presented that at GDC?
No, I have
It
not.
would be a really good
The game design
conference.
conference.
Yeah, the International Game Design Conference in San Francisco.
Yeah.
I think this would actually be a good talk just for anybody who's looking at getting into it, especially.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
And I think it actually would help a lot of writers while I was sitting there and like, oh, this is how it could be. So I think that would actually be a really good talk for GDC.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. GDC is very cool. I haven't been in years.
I haven't been in I stopped starting in 2014.
It's like massive now, but yeah, that'd be, man, presenting at GDC was like a career goal when I was a designer. So that would be really cool. That's a great idea.
What was that conference you said? Big Design what?
It's just called Big Design.
Big design conference.
Yep, Big Design
It's
Conference.
in November, October, November?
September?
This year.
Fall?
I'm
Yeah,
helping
you're right,
with
they
some of
Nice.
it.
Yep.
So it's going to be in September. this
Okay.
year.
Yeah, if you just Google Big Design Conference Dallas, it'll come up, and it'll probably be at the Crown Plaza in Addison, where it's been.
We'll have a
happy.
discount code.
Hey, tune in next month to get your.
We'll have a discount code.
They'll
Yeah.
also have Industry Giants.
Yep,
Yes.
Industry
Same
Giants is
time.
the same time.
Yeah.
And Industry Giants is geared a lot towards like animation and film.
I'm trying to help them get some gaming in there.
Oh,
This
cool.
time around. So I was looking at
You should look at South by
some of
too.
that.
South by's got a whole gaming track.
That's true. Yeah.
They added that recently.
That would be very
One
cool.
thing Randy mentioned is that how a car may project the direction there, right?
Mhm.
So I was thinking about something similar is that some people are testing, like experimenting on dynamic road marks. So if someone push a button, they want to cross the street will change the marks to allow that to happen. And then that would be pretty, I was thinking would be fitting in the green box.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a group
Yeah.
called Solar Roadways, is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah, I think so. It's also
But
about-
basically solar panels that have LEDs built in that you can program and change.
Nice. Yeah, that
in
makes
parking
sense.
lots and roads and sidewalks and.
That would be very cool. I mean, it literally lights your way.
I don't know that we do it in too many states here, but as you're exiting, the spacing between the actual dashes on the road actually decrease as you get closer to an exit. So it's kind of one of those things where it actually makes it look like you're getting closer up to, just spatially it makes it look, so it's very much in the real space, but it's indicating a proximity to an exit.
Huh.
Isn't that opposite? Wouldn't that feel like you're going faster and faster? Because
It does.
The dots are
Exactly.
closer and closer together.
Yeah, the illusion is that, so it's like, oh, hurry up and get over. So you're running out of time. It's kind of.
Kind of that's very cool. Yeah, I could see that. I mean, especially if there's like a sharp turn somewhere, you do that to force people to be like, "Oh, I'm going too fast. Slow down." That's a cool perceptual thing, which again goes to the behavior aspect of psychology, like I mentioned, is the other key component with UX. Cool. Yeah.
Like on Waze, we have the police and the speed cameras. Where would that fit in there? Would that be diegetic in the narrative, in the virtual space, or?
So it's still like iconography, I believe I haven't used Waze in a while, but it's iconography. Yeah, so it becomes spatial, right? So it's it's close. And again, there might not be a good reason to have a diegetic, turn-by-turn navigation. What we have now, I mean, if we just refine it, may be what is the optimum from a usability and user experience standpoint.
Piggybacking on what somebody else said about this carrying over to just like flat or static graphics, what about just like a dashboard graphic on a web page or whatever, like you check your credit or whatever and you get the little, indicator or whatever. How do these concepts kind of carry over to just sort of flat design or 2D design? Is it still considered, a HUD, or is it just information on a page? I mean, what's the kind of crossover there?
So I think at that point becomes just information on a page. It's because unless that graph is also represented elsewhere, that then you could, formulate the look and feel of that graph to this real world example. Otherwise, I think it's then, you basically chose to use, a needle graph versus a bar chart versus, a donut chart. And I think at that point, it's just displaying information in a non-diegetic way, right? Because especially if it's like something as hard to perceive as like your credit score or something, then that is a non-diegetic thing.
It is a very interactive graph. It could be a non-diegetic.
Yeah. Yeah. And again,
Look into a crowd and everybody's credit score is over there.
Right, exactly.
I think that one example that may fit in a bit better would be, say, if you need to take a photo of a credit card or a check to input that, they'll give you instruction with the frame and then they display the value they see, something like that. That would be
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so it's taking that diegetic thing, which is your credit card, and trying to present it like your card on the screen, or something like that. So, that's another example. If you look at, say, Google Wallet or Apple Wallet, right? They are actually showing you what your actual card looks like. So my Visa signature card has the black and green, and my whatever card is blue and white and whatever. So they're trying to make it look like the actual card, which I think moves it more into like a meta. Schemorphic, yeah, it is schemorphic. But it's still flat, right? Because they're still flattening the colors and using, they're not really using shadowing to indicate depth and whatnot. So I think that's kind of in the realm. So if you shaped the, your dashboard representative of something in the real world, I think they would probably get more meta.
Very good talk on why you shouldn't do that and just have a 2D as a 2D. Just don't. It actually doesn't add anything. So.
3D bad.
Does any of this concept, apply to a scenario? For example, currently I have a client in family, and if a customer comes, or prospective customer comes, and then they go through, let's say, if you go to their team site and then they have a tool, interactive, and you put in something, and then they give you some kind of suggestion, right, recommendation. And if you're interested, then you go in and you apply for the product or service. Will any of this concept apply here?
So it's for people to apply, and it's in the actual bank itself?
There are two parts. One is they can put information, and then this tool will give them some kind of recommendation.
The touch screen or kiosk, what's the interface? How do you?
Just a
screen.
So you're on your laptop at home.
Okay. Okay.
or mobile. Yeah, either way.
I guess, if I can paraphrase it, it's really about, back in the day, or even now, you have all the functionality on the page, right? You click here, you go here, you click here, you go there. Whereas now they're trying to anticipate, maybe by kind of what you want to do, you kind of say it, and then the interface itself becomes very dynamic.
Yeah, the tool has a bit more intelligence, and so then after the user enters information, and the tool should have some intelligence to make intelligent recommendations for products or services. Would any of this concept of
I mean, if I'm spitballing, if I'm thinking, so if the full customer journey is I come to the site and eventually make it through the site and then come into the actual bank, and that's the full experience that you want the user to experience, then potentially you start with a very, conventional non-diegetic, image, sign up here, whatever, and then you could maybe slowly move it a bit more into the meta space and start incorporating what the actual bank looks like, the actual inside space of the bank, to then say, look how inviting our bank is. Why don't you come out to your local bank that is on the corner of 6th and Arapahoe and walk in and continue the process. So I think maybe you could try and, it really becomes more of a problem of what are the challenges that people are having with it. If people are moving through it efficiently and effectively and they're happy with it, then no, stick non-diegetically and you're fine. If it turns out that you're seeing a lot of abandonment and it's because of the fact that people, and you through your user research, you learn that the reason why people are abandoning it is they find it dull or boring, their satisfaction is low, then maybe you want to try and make it a bit more immersive and pull them in a bit more by changing the look and feel of the background or anything to make it look more like the actual bank that presumably architects have determined is inviting to people.
But have you seen your experience? I mean, that seems very complex. Like, have you seen that actually in action producing any decent results in your experience, or is it like way too complicated, but just keep it simple?
So, I mean, again, the keep it simple, that I mean, all UIs tend to be simple, but again, it fundamentally comes back to the user problem. So, have I really looked? No. But again, it's the fundamental user problem. Right? If you think basic usability, you're thinking efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. Those are the three things. This is what like the ISO 2024, whatever the standard is. Those are the three things you look for. And so if it's efficient and effective, basically people are able to submit their form and are doing so efficiently, then the last thing is that satisfaction, right? Which is just gut reaction. Do people like it? If they're like, no, it's ugly, might be really efficient, but it's ugly, satisfaction is low, now your usability is low. So you would first need to figure out where that problem is. Is it efficiency, effectiveness, satisfaction? And then you could start tackling it. And then whether or not it's a big challenge becomes irrelevant because the potential value of having solved this problem becomes super high. But it's only after you've identified exactly what that problem is and why.
Does diegetic have to have a geospatial component, like a physical space sense?
Well, again, I think if you think of, say, like if we built this room in a virtual environment, and I'm moving through the virtual environment that looks like this room, but I'm not physically moving in the room, then I've forgotten your question.
So to be diegetic, like maybe to go back to her question, right? So there has to be some sort of geospatial, physical movement space aspect to it. So real estate's getting real big into doing these 360 videos. You can walk through a house virtually on your computer or in a headset. And you can display information in there, it'd be great. But you have to be moving, you have to have some depth, you have to have some sort of spatial component for it to be diegetic. If you're not going to map out the bank and say, you need to go talk to the loan officer, he's in the third row in the second cubicle down, and give them that display, there's really no diegetic display of here's your credit score and here's how much we're going to loan you and here's what your retirement plan should be. There's no spatial geographic component to that.
Well, again, if you do think as like a simulation, then that essentially is diegetic because you are moving through the virtual space. It's just not the real world. So it's diegetic to the simulation, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So then like characters in that simulation are aware of the virtual space and are perceiving it, but not necessarily people in the actual bank because there aren't virtual avatars running around.
There's no reason to map out the bank.
I don't know.
Your phone could say, look for the blue light, and a blue light outside his office lights up.
Yeah. I mean, I think there could be some cool applications of it, but again, what value and where, I don't know.
It's just a lot cooler to look at it and see.
It is a lot cooler. It's true, but I mean, yeah, I mean,
I my iPad everywhere.
what if they did tell you, hey, look how easy it is to move to our bank and meet the loan officer? He's right here, second door on the left. You can meet her right now. Oh, she's available at this time. And then you go in there and it looks like that representation, and you do have like a light that lights up that says, oh, hey, you're here for your appointment, and it's colored green and the green light lights up. Go meet, Suzanne, she's ready for you. That could be cool, I don't know. I mean, I think there is some application, whether or not it has business value or, experience value, I don't know, but it could be cool. I hate to say no to anything just because whenever you say no, actually I should say no because that will motivate people to be like, aha, I will prove you wrong. So, cool. Anything else?
Also really interesting, I've been looking at kind of voice apps and some of that and how all of this stuff still applies. I mean, there's still a narrative, there's an ideal conversation, there's, you can go on to, I think Google's got theirs, and they've got a really good, very short course that kind of gets you, oh man, this is a whole new world. But I think a lot of those things, when you start thinking contextually and you stop thinking visually, you start thinking about, what other clues are there that's in that virtual space. So when you think about GPS and you arrive at the building and you have a haptic feedback because your phone buzzes and the other person, because you're both in the same space, their phone dings or buzzes. And so you have that connection where both indicates those things. So I think there's a lot of options outside of the purely visual. I know we mostly work in that visual space, but I think as we start looking at some of those other things, some of those other components, it's that same design thinking, but you start thinking about not just sight.
Have you looked at Earplay? Earplay does a lot of the actual narrative games on the Alexa.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
Very
check that out. They actually do a lot of it. Their first game was Codename Sigma, and that they used a lot of sound design to actually make you sort of visualize what you're going through. So they had you at one point jump out the window, and you're just like through the window, right? So you can hear that glass wave. That might be something you want to check out.
Yeah.
That's
So
radio
this-
theater.
Yes, actually, that's what they try to base it off of.
That reminds me of these guys, which they closed down, unfortunately. So they made earplugs that there are different filters for different contexts. So if there's a setting for restaurants, they will kind of try to avoid the sun around and behind, but the sun in front of you. So if you're on the road, they will try to make sure that you can still hear the siren or things that will matter to you, but try to screen out the wind and stuff like that. They invented partly to address people with hearing problems, but I think that will kind of in a very similar context, but in a audio.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think this model applies to audio as well. If you replace the virtual space, which is the visual space aspect, with the fourth wall of audio, it becomes the same thing. So to me, the fourth wall of sound becomes, again, I'm thinking from a video game standpoint, but it basically becomes your front three speakers. And each speaker is that physical wall. It's literally what's separating the real world from the virtual world, and all the surround speakers is beyond that. So you could have, if you're trying to find an object, you could have something diegetic to where it's actually beeping and how you're turning and it tells you which speaker it's coming from, right? Versus something that is meta where you hear someone's voice, but to make it very clear, they'll still play it out of your center speaker, so that way you can hear it, even though it's coming from someone in your back left. And then, spatially, again, so it maybe when you get closer, it just starts beeping, and it's just an annoying beeping sound for us, the audience, that's not in a way that the characters in, the whatever fantasy environment actually have anything that beeps like that. So I think absolutely audio can follow the same model and think about whether or not that piece of audio and that component of audio, what information it's displaying, and again, whether or not characters in that world can hear it, and whether or not it's essentially in front of you, coming just right at the speaker, or it is taking into account where that sound is located in the space. That makes sense.
All right, so let's close it up. Let's give it up for John. We'll be here a little bit longer if you want to ask any more questions.
Absolutely.
I know people got to go. So thank you very much. Vish, we'll be talking on February 6th. That'll be our next talk, and that one's going to be up in Plano. I've already posted it, so you can RSVP already.
Cool.
Post comments, I saw some of those links were already posted on the event, so you guys can go out and Meetup and see those links. And post photos if you took any. Appreciate it, tell your friends, we're always trying to grow.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for coming. And thanks for having me.